just begin by quoting again the Welsh historian Gwyn Lewis, who writes, "From the beginning of the revolution, serious contradictions began to emerge between the rhetoric of liberty, equality and fraternity and the reality of a revolution led by a wealthy, propertied elite. Property is the key word which unlocks the major mysteries of the revolution. Although the Declaration of the Rights of Man, passed on the 26th of August 1789, begins with the famous formulation that all men are born free and equal in rights, we have to recall that Article 17 declared property to be inviolable and sacred. Among the first legislation passed by the Constituent Assembly on the 22nd of December 1789 was that to qualify as a voter one needed to pay the equivalent in direct taxes of 3 days' work. This group of about 4 million would choose about 50,000 electors who qualified by paying the equivalent of 10 days' work. To qualify as a deputy one had to be very rich indeed, paying over 50,000 livres a year in taxation. This, according to the radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat, was the aristocracy of wealth replacing the old aristocracy of birth." Now we're coming to a section which can be best described as state against church. The Constituent Assembly wished to bring the church completely under its control, and to attain this end it abolished tithes and nationalized the possessions of the church on the 2nd of November 1789, stating that the church's wealth should be placed at the disposal of the nation. Monsignor de Boisgelin, Archbishop of Aix-en-Provence, warned that the church's wealth had been given for clearly defined purposes, among them the maintenance of hospitals and schools, and he declared that the proposal jeopardized the entire social and educational system of France. The Archbishop proved to be correct. In 1847, the number of hospitals in France was 47% lower than in 1789. And in 1799, there were only 12,000 students in colleges, as opposed to 50,000 in 1789. The poor suffered terribly as a result of the end of monastic charity and the confiscation of endowments established for the relief of property. The nationalization of the wealth of the church did not solve the problem of national bankruptcy. The marketing of all the estates of the church at the same time caused a rapid fall in values, and the land was snapped up eagerly at bargain prices, principally by the rich bourgeoisie. And then the French government printed paper money called assignats. Initially, these were limited to the value of the land confiscated from the church and sold. But then, of course, when they ran out, they just started printing more and more, and in the end they became completely worthless. But people were forced to accept them. The salaries of the clergy were to be paid in future by an annual grant from the Treasury. On the 13th of February 1790, monastic vows were abolished in the name of religious freedom, and the religious orders suppressed. The religious life had long been the target of scathing denunciations by the philosophe, Voltaire in particular. A life dedicated to God through prayer was considered by them to be useless and of no value to society. Along with the philosophes and liberal intellectuals, Freemasons were particularly active in denouncing monasticism as a way of life. Municipal officers visited all the religious orders of men and women and gave each member of the community the option of leaving. Those who chose to do so were promised an indemnity which would be sufficient for them to live upon. Those who wished to remain in the religious life were permitted to do so, but they would be housed irrespective of their order in a few monasteries and convents which could be spared for this purpose, when the rest were sold. Where some orders of monks or friars were concerned, most of the men decided to leave. The monastery at Cluny, once the greatest and most famous in the world, now only had 50 Benedictine monks, in contrast with 300 in the 13th century. Only 2 of the 50 monks opted to remain in the religious life, and the monastery was sold to the town. The Abbey Church, which was one of the wonders of the Middle Ages, was almost completely destroyed, and many of the priceless treasures of its library burned by a revolutionary mob. The destruction of Cluny was a monstrous crime against the cultural patrimony of Europe. The fact that so many men opted to accept the pension doesn't necessarily indicate that they did so as a result of disenchantment with the religious life, as you'll see that if you read Mary's thesis when it's published. The houses of union in which those who chose to remain were to be placed were to be composed of men from different orders who would be expected to choose a superior from among themselves for a 2-year term. and decide upon what rule they would follow. So strict Cistercians, they could be compared to share a house, say, with Franciscans, and work out a rule that they would be satisfactory to them all, which in fact couldn't be done. And rather than do that, they decided they would leave the religious life. But even those who opted for these houses of union, they didn't stay in them very long, because on the 18th of August 1792, it was deemed that all religious houses, including the houses of union, should be suppressed in France. So they lasted little over a year. Among the male orders, the Carthusians, Trappists, and Capuchins remained faithful to their vows with very few exceptions. France's 45,000 nuns were almost unanimous in opposing the dissolution of their convents. The commissioners were told by a community of Carmelites, "The yoke of the Lord is sweet, and by some visitandines we ask to live and die in a holy, blissful state which we have freely embraced, which we zealously observe, and which constitutes the sole happiness of our days." A surprising tribute to the female religious of France came from Voltaire, who was the most scathing critic of the Church before the Revolution. Voltaire said, and it is surprising, "Perhaps there is nothing greater on earth than the sacrifice of youth and beauty, often of high birth, made by the gentle sex in order to work in hospitals for the relief of human misery, the sight of which is so revolting to our delicacy. People separated from the Roman religion have imitated, but imperfectly, so generous a charity." On the 12th of July 1790, a bill to regulate the Church entitled "The Civil Constitution of the Clergy" was passed. It contained a series of measures intended to deprive the Church in France of its independence. The Church was to become no more than a state agency, with the clergy reduced to the status of civil servants. In his study of the Church and the Revolution, J. McManus writes, "If there was a point at which the Revolution went wrong, it was when the Constituent Assembly imposed the oath of the civil constitution of the clergy." Monsignor Emery, superior of the Society of Saint-Sulpice, made clear why no true Catholic could accept the Constitution when he wrote, "To subject a power emanating from that of Jesus Christ himself to civil authority is opposed to revelation." Diocesan boundaries were to agree with those of the new departments which had been set up in France. 57 episcopal sees were suppressed. All appeals to Rome were forbidden. Bishops were to be elected by the electoral assembly of their department, and they must take an oath of loyalty to the nation, the king, the law, and the constitution. Now, I've just pointed out to you, the electoral assembly was restricted to a very, very minuscule minority of the people in France, some of whom you would be Jews, atheists, Protestants, but they were all entitled to vote who they wanted to be their bishop, who they wanted to be their parish priest. Bishops were forbidden to seek the traditional bull from Rome confirming them in their office, and they were only permitted to inform the Pope that they had been elected as bishop. Parish priests were to be elected by the electoral assembly of their districts, which in practice were of course the rich bourgeoisie. Bishops and priests were thus commanded to swear an oath of loyalty to a constitution which in effect denied the Holy See any effective power over the Church in France. Pope Pius VI urged Louis XVI not to sign the bill. The king replied that if he did not, his life and the lives of his family would be endangered. The king promulgated the constitution on the 24th of August and was rebuked by the Pope in a confidential brief sent to the king on the 22nd of September. So I must point out here, you see, that up to this point, everything in the Revolution is imposed legally from above. It's passed by the Assembly, signed by the King. Everything that's happened so far is strictly legal. Rather like what happened after Vatican II. It was all imposed and signed by the Pope. And a revolution that comes from above like that is very, very effective. On the 27th of November 1790, a decree stipulated that all bishops and priests should, under pain of losing their offices, take an oath of loyalty to the revolutionary constitution, which included acceptance of the civil constitution of the clergy, and that all who refused and continued to exercise their priestly functions should be prosecuted as disturbers of the public peace. That was what I mentioned when I was talking about the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that people had religious liberty as long as they didn't disturb the public peace. The bill received the unwilling assent of King Louis XVI on the 26th of September 1790. The date set for taking the oath was the 23rd of January 1791. To their credit, 118 out of 125 bishops refused to take the oath. and of the 7 who did, 4 were already discredited because of their unbelief or scandalous lives. So this is interesting. I mentioned to you that all the French bishops were taken from the ranks of the aristocracy. A great number of them really had no true vocation, and they just did it to earn a living. But when it came to the crunch, you know, they behaved like, you know, really good Catholics. As we say in England, they kept their end up. It's a cricketing term. The bishop of the suppressed diocese of Senez declared, "I can no more renounce the spiritual contract which binds me to my church than I can renounce the promises of my baptism. I belong to my flock in life and in death. If God wishes to test his own, the 18th century, like the 1st century, will have its martyrs." Almost half the parish clergy refused to take the oath, and in some areas the figure was 90%, and many of those who took the oath retracted when they fully understood what it implied. The fact that over half the clergy took the oath was to no small extent due to the weakness of Pope Pius VI and his Curia. They feared that an open confrontation with the French Assembly could lead to a schism and the annexation of the papal territory of Avignon. The result was an 8-month irreparable delay, during the course of which, in an unforeseen way, a concatenation of circumstances caused the very schism which it had been hoped would be avoided. Nor did the delay save the papal lands of the Comtat Venaissin and the city of Avignon, which were eventually annexed on the 14th of September 1791. The Constituent Assembly then commanded the ordination of priests and bishops for the Constitutional Church. The Constitutional Church was the one made up by the priests and bishops who'd taken the oath. But even of the 7 bishops who'd taken the oath, only one of them agreed to ordain any priests or bishops, and that of course was Talleyrand. And on the 24th of February 1791, he consecrated 2 of the juring priests as bishops. A juring priest is one who took the oath, a non-juring priest is one who refused. 2 months later, Jean-Baptiste Gobel, coadjutor Bishop of Basel, who had been advanced to the position of Archbishop of Paris, ordained another 26. This made it essential for the Pope to react. Now they were consecrating bishops without his authority. He couldn't remain silent any longer. And on the 10th of March 1791, in his brief Quod Aliquantum, he condemned the civil constitution of the clergy because it mortally wounded the divine constitution of the Church with its canonical investment of bishops, the election of priests, and the creation of episcopal councils. In the following brief, Caritas, he declared the ordinations of new bishops sacrilegious, prohibited them from performing their offices, and threatened with suspension all priests who refused to recant their oaths. On the same occasion, the Pope strongly condemned the Declaration of the Rights of Man as contradictory to Catholic doctrine regarding the origin of authority of the state, freedom of religion, and social inequality. The civil constitution of the clergy brought about the existence of 2 churches in France, a constitutional one subservient to the authority of the state, and a refractory one maintaining obedience to the Pope. Only Daniel Rotz warns that it would be wrong to pass too hasty a judgment on all the constitutional clergy. Many of them were excellent priests who took the oath in order to avoid abandoning their parishioners. Daniel Rotz writes, "Their ranks included heroes and cowards, chaste and unchaste, informers and victims of the guillotine. It would be unfair to despise them all simply because they were mistaken, often in good faith, but the faithful as a whole rejected any such distinction, and the entire constitutional clergy found itself reprobated by loyal Catholics." On the 20th of September, the National Assembly legalized divorce and established the civil status, which deprived Catholic baptisms, weddings, and funerals of any legal status. To this day, Catholics in France have to go through 2 weddings, a civil wedding recognized by the state, and then a church wedding. These measures deprived the constitutional clergy of any credibility that some of them might have retained. Daniel Rotz writes, "As for the constitutional church, it too experienced an increasing sense of anxiety. Priests and bishops who had sincerely embraced the revolution in the hope of seeing the primitive church reborn were disillusioned. The few citizens who attended their masses were often by no means edifying. The authorities whose business it was to protect them did not hesitate to employ them as instruments of power, ordering them to justify from the pulpit any measures voted by the assembly. The episcopal palaces were taken from their occupants on the grounds that their magnificence was not in accord with the simplicity of the ecclesiastical state. Public processions were forbidden. Objects of worship and piety, even crucifixes, were removed from the churches and their bronze melted down. The smallest gratuity was prohibited. Woe betide a cure who accepted an offering for a baptism or a marriage. Worse still, the marriage of priests was allowed in the name of liberty, and bishops were forbidden to punish those of their clergy who took advantage of this right. The very bases of Christian society, which those who took the oath had expected to preserve, were crumbling. On the 20th of September, the eve of its dissolution, the Assembly instituted divorce, and on the same day it established civil status, depriving the constitutional clergy of all hold upon the faithful, since baptism, marriage, and religious burial were no longer to have any legal significance. The chastisement of schism, to quote the Abbé Sicard, fell upon the revolutionary church, inflicted by those same individuals whom she had regarded as her allies. The hour was approaching when the revolution would rage not against the church alone, but against God. I remember a couple of years ago, someone asked John Rowe, when are we going to hear something good about the church? Because it's most of the history is of mistakes, weak popes, bad popes. Well, I think we're going to hear something good about the church now, in the Vatican II sense of the church as the people. We're going to see Catholics behaving like Catholics. And it is interesting, again, what Dr. White was saying about Satan, that he always tried to do evil, but he always turned into good. The first event I want to talk to you about are the September massacres. The direction that the revolution would take was made clear between the 2nd and the 6th of September 1792, with the notorious September massacres that shocked the whole of Europe. France was at war with Austria and Prussia, and a Prussian army had crossed the border in August. The country had been proclaimed to be in danger. A mood of hysteria reigned in Paris. On the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of September, a platoon of the National Guard dragged 3 priests from a cab that was taking them to jail and hacked them to pieces. This set in train a series of massacres in most of the prisons of Paris that lasted for 48 hours. 1,100 prisoners were massacred, with 250 priests among them, including 3 bishops. The victims of the massacre were subjected to the travesty of a trial. After that, they would pass through a door between 2 lines of killers armed with sabres, knives, and hatchets, who would literally hack them to death. All the priests were asked the same question: have you taken the oath? Not one of these priests was prepared to save his life by saying no. That none of them would lie. And one of the judges of the pseudo-trials, his name was Jean-Denis Violet, remarked the next day, he said, I don't understand. They seemed happy. They went to death as to a wedding. It was exactly what Thomas More said when he saw the first Carthusian martyrs being taken to Tyburn. He said to his daughter who was there, look, they're going like bridegrooms to a wedding. Many women and children were among the victims of the massacre, the most notable being the beautiful Princess de Lamballe, who was a very close friend of Marie Antoinette. She could have saved her life by swearing an oath of hatred for the king, queen, and monarchy, but she refused. The princess was hacked to death in minutes, and her body subjected to unspeakable mutilations. One fanatical Republican went to the extent of tearing her heart out from her body and eating it. The head of the princess was struck off and carried to the temple where the royal family were imprisoned, so that Marie Antoinette could see how the people avenged themselves on tyrants. One of the most dreaded of the revolutionaries, the communist Babeuf, who eventually got guillotined himself, he would soon write this maxim, in which some historians have detected an avowal that there were invisible prompters behind the scenes. Babeuf said, "It is essential to make the people perpetrate deeds that will prevent them from turning back." On the 10th of September 1792, Gouverneur Morris, the American minister to France, dispatched an objective but critical report of the massacres to Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. The only person I've ever heard of, his Christian name is Gouverneur. Someone might be able to tell me why that was later. This is what Gouverneur Morris said. "We have had 1 week of unchecked murders in which some thousands have perished in the city. It began with between 200 and 300 of the clergy who had been shut up because they would not take the oaths prescribed by law, and which they said was contrary to their conscience. These executors of a speedy justice went to the Abbey, where the persons were confined who were at court on the 10th. These were dispatched also, and afterwards visited the other prisons. All those who were confined either on account of accusation or suspicious of crimes were destroyed. Madame de Lamballe was, I believe, the only woman killed, which isn't correct. and she was beheaded and emboweled. The head and entrails were paraded on pikes through the streets, and the body dragged after them. They continued, I am told, at the temple, where the former royal family were now imprisoned, till the Queen looked out at this horrid spectacle. Yesterday the prisoners from Orleans were put to death at Versailles. The destruction began here about 5 in the afternoon on Sunday the 2nd instant. This dispatch did not reach Thomas Jefferson until the 10th of January 1793, but he had already seen an account of the massacres in the American press, some organs of which had condemned the massacres as barbarous. Well, this reaction in the American press, American papers condemning the September massacres as barbarous, it provoked a very indignant editorial in the 7th of November 1792 issue of the National Gazette, which was the official paper of Jefferson's Republican Party. The editor, Philip Freneau, praised the massacres in the most enthusiastic terms and denounced those who had condemned them. Whether he consulted his eminent patron Jefferson before writing an editorial from which I'll quote, nobody knows. But what is certain that this editorial did not evoke one word of criticism from Jefferson. This is Freneau's editorial, describing these massacres I've just told you about. The great scene that has passed in the capital of France is a lesson worthy of the serious attention of every monarch in Europe. It is sickening to hear our prostituted prince call the French barbarous and inhuman, because, when justly incensed, they have made an example of 2,000 or 3,000 scoundrels to rescue the liberties of millions of honest men. France had not yet become a republic. King Louis XVI had been pressured into accepting the revolutionary constitution on the 14th of September 1791, but this did no more than reprieve the monarchy. And on the 22nd of September 1792, the country was proclaimed a republic. King Louis XVI was condemned to death by a narrow majority. The confessor chosen by the king before his execution was an Irish priest, the Abbé Edgeworth de Firmont, and he passed the entire night beside Louis after hearing his confession, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of the 21st of January 1793 he offered Mass. King Louis XVI received Holy Communion for the last time. A covered cart was waiting outside the prison. The king and his confessor climbed in, and the priest did not leave his side until the end. Throughout his last journey the king read the prayer for the dying. King Louis behaved throughout with the courage and dignity expected of a king, in marked contrast with some of the men who had condemned him, who died screaming with terror later on that year when their own turn came to mount the same scaffold. Once on the platform he began to address the crowd in a loud voice. "My people, I die innocent of the crimes with which I have been accused. I tell you this as I am about to appear in the presence of God. I pardon those who have condemned me, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed will never rebound upon France." Santerre, commander of the National Guard in Paris, cried out, "Tambour," drums. The drums of the guardsmen drowned the voice of their sovereign. The king was placed face down on the plank which was used to position the victims for the descent of the blade. Father Edgeworth de Firmont fell on his knees, facing the window of the guillotine through which the king's head protruded. As the heavy blade fell, this faithful priest cried out the words which have echoed through the centuries, "Son of St. Louis, mount into heaven." On that day, a spectator later recalled, "Everyone walked slowly, and we hardly dared to look at one another." Chrétien Malesherbes, who had volunteered to defend the king at his trial and paid for this by going to the guillotine with members of his family, insisted that the king had paid with his own blood for being unwilling to shed that of others. The Protestant Prime Minister of England, William Pitt, described the murder of the king as the foulest and most atrocious act the world has ever seen. Simon Schama states that it made clear to the British government that it was now dealing with a phenomenon of uncontainable barbarism and irrationality. Queen Marie Antoinette was guillotined on the 16th of October of the same year. She displayed the same noble bearing that the king had shown. The Queen's request for a confessor who had not taken the oath of loyalty to the civil constitution was denied, and she refused to confess herself to one who had. Thomas Jefferson welcomed the news of what was taking place in 1793 and expressed only the faintest regrets about the wholesale executions or about the deaths of the king and queen and the many aristocrats that he had known personally. C.C. O'Brien remarks, "Jefferson was a passionate devotee of the French Revolution, but he was also a calculating and subtle propagandist in its favor. Jefferson maintained that people should be forced to be free, although he didn't actually apply this principle to the slaves on his estate. He even justified the slaughter with an agricultural metaphor. Jefferson said, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." And he looked forward to the day when a French Republican army would invade England and sweep away the monstrosities of crown, priests and aristocracy, so that he could come to London and dine with the victorious French general. On the 3rd of January 1793, a few days before the execution of the king, Jefferson wrote his famous Adam and Eve letter to William Short, his private secretary in Paris from 1785 to 1789. Jefferson really liked Short, and when he returned to the USA, he recommended him for the position of chargé d'affaires in Paris. But then he was very far from pleased when his protégé began to utter what Jefferson described as blasphemies against the revolution. Any criticism of the revolution was considered to be a blasphemy. In his famous Adam and Eve letter, dated the 3rd of January 1793, Jefferson castigated Short for these blasphemies and explained that while he regretted the shedding of innocent blood, it would be better to have only 2 people living still in every country in the world, provided they were free. Jefferson's entire case rested on what he considered to be an incontestable axiom, that the revolution had brought liberty to those who had previously been deprived of it. To call this axiom into question was nothing less than blasphemy. Here are his exact words: "The liberty of the whole world was depending on the issue of the contest, and was ever such a prize won with so little innocent blood. My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this contest, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the world desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country, but left free, it would be better than as it now is. I have expressed to you my sentiments because they are really those of 99 in 100 of our citizens. The universal feasts and rejoicings which have lately been had on account of the successes of the French show the genuine effusions of their hearts. You have been wounded by the sufferings of your friends, and have by this circumstance been hurried into a temper of mind which would be extremely disrelished if known to your countrymen." Jefferson was certainly correct in claiming that the majority opinion in the USA was enthusiastic about the revolution. In his study, Contemporary American Opinion of the French Revolution, Charles Downe Hazen describes the mounting excitement of this period. Though Americans had been interested in the revolution from the very outset for a variety of reasons, it was only toward the close of the year 1792 that this interest was publicly manifested. But when the monarch was completely overthrown and the Republic proclaimed, all America was thrilled. From this time on, the movements of the French armies were followed with great excitement, and when, towards the close of this year, the Republic had so far asserted itself as to have driven back the invaders, the revolution seemed so far accomplished as to demand a public manifestation of joy on the part of the Americans. Hazen then goes on to describe civic feasts in honor of the French Revolution in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia in December 1792 and January 1793. Hazen adds, "These celebrations were not local. They occurred in the South, in the North, and in the Middle States. Philadelphia saw scores of them." Now, I'd like to read you an assessment, Edmund Burke's assessment of the Revolution, which differs somewhat from Jefferson's, so I'll leave you to decide which one is more accurate. This is what Edmund Burke said. "The French have proved themselves the ablest architects of ruin that ever existed in the world. They have completely pulled down to the ground their monarchy, their church, their nobility, their law, their revenue, their army, their navy, their commerce, their arts, and their manufactures. They are now lying in a sort of trance, an epileptic fit, exposed to the pity or derision of mankind, in wild, ridiculous, convulsive movements, impotent to every purpose but that of dashing out their brains against the pavement. Yet they are so unwise as to glory in a revolution which is a shame and disgrace to them. They have made their way to the very worst constitution in the world by the destruction of their country." From September 1793 until the guillotining of Robespierre in July 1794, the whole of France was engulfed by what became known as the Terror. The Terror was not formally declared by law, but was permitted and soon encouraged by the ruling powers. Henri Daniel Rots writes, "Christian France was swept by a wave of fanaticism at once cruel, despicable, and absurd, such as always experienced at times of mass hysteria. Determined atheists, loyal in varying degrees to the teaching of the philosophe, availed themselves of this opportunity to conduct operations whose purpose was nothing less than the suppression of all belief. It was not only against the church that the revolution directed its attack, but against the faith itself, against God. On the 6th of April 1793, the Committee of Public Safety was established by the Convention. It was comprised of 9, later 12 members, and it became the key organ of the Terror. The dominant voice for the first 2 months was that of Danton, who would later sign his death warrant by preaching a policy of union and reconciliation within the Republic, and by seeking to abate the pitiless severity of the Revolutionary Tribunal, which he himself had set up. As the reign of terror developed, Danton began to lose power to Robespierre, and he resigned from the committee on the 10th of July 1793. 2 weeks later, on the 27th of July, Maximilien Robespierre was elected. He was to be the most notorious member of the committee, and for a period could be said to be the committee. In the 3 months that followed the guillotining of Danton on the 5th of April 1794, Robespierre reigned supreme, nominating all the members of government committees, placing his supporters in all positions of influence within the Commune of Paris, and assuming total control of the Revolutionary Tribunal. He reigned by terror and abused the power invested in him. Second only to Robespierre in notoriety was his fervent disciple, Louis de Saint-Just, who had been foremost among those demanding the execution of the king. If the king is innocent, the people are guilty, Saint-Just said. He initiated the attacks upon Danton that sent him to the scaffold. Saint-Just even proposed that Robespierre should be created dictator of France, and that boys should be taken from their parents at the age of 7 and brought up by the state. The mandate of the Committee of Public Safety included all matters of internal order and policy, and was expanded to include control of the army. Although in theory France was still governed by the Convention, executive power was in practice invested in the committee. Simon Skarmer describes it as the most concentrated state machine France has ever experienced. What amounted to a charter of terror, the law of suspects of the 17th of September 1793, gave the committee sweeping powers of arrest and punishment over anyone included in the all-embracing category of those harbouring counter-revolutionary designs. Saint-Just insisted that the law should be applied with the utmost rigour. Between the people and their enemies there can be nothing in common but the sword. We must govern by iron those who cannot be governed by justice. We must oppress the tyrant. It is impossible for the revolutionary law to be executed unless the government itself is truly revolutionary. The French equivalent of civil rights such as habeas corpus and trial by jury were suspended in the case of anyone endangering the security of the state. And the very fact that a citizen was accused of this crime by the Committee of Public Safety was considered irrefutable proof of his guilt. In the trials of so-called enemies of state, the calling of witnesses was left to the discretion of the court, and the accused was denied the aid of a defence counsel. When he was found guilty, the mandatory sentence was death. The law of suspects ushered in a terrible phase of the terror during the spring and summer of 1794. Whole batches of suspects were condemned and sent to their deaths in the Place de la Révolution, Paris. The vast majority were political suspects, in most cases men who had been fervent supporters of the events of 1789. Representatives on mission were dispatched by the Convention to the departments of France to ensure compliance with the will of the Convention, which from September 1793 meant the will of the Committee of Public Safety. Their mandate was concerned primarily with judicial and punitive matters, and they were invested with the authority to establish revolutionary tribunals and to try suspects accused of anti-revolutionary activities. Each commune was to set up a committee of surveillance, and every citizen was urged to denounce anyone he suspected of this crime. Many Frenchmen were denounced and went to their deaths to satisfy the personal animosity of their neighbours. Throughout the autumn of 1793, representatives on mission had been free to interpret their role much as they wished. This phase of the terror was anarchic, uncoordinated, and little subject to central direction. Its characteristic instruments were the revolutionary armies, which mushroomed through the provinces in imitation of that of Paris, and whose numbers may have reached 48,000 men at their height. Terroristic jacks of all trades, their purpose was to intimidate and punish, arrest and repress anyone suspected of activities that could be deemed hostile to the revolution. An integral aspect of the terror was the de-Christianization of France. It was not initiated as an official policy of the Convention, but the Convention did not attempt to curtail it, and eventually endorsed it by adopting a new anti-Christian calendar on the 6th of October 1793, in which years were to be numbered not from the birth of Christ, but from the inauguration of the Republic on the 22nd of September 1792. This meant that it was already year 2 when the revolutionary calendar was imposed. The year began with the 22nd of September, and the first month was named Vendémiaire, and it ended on the 21st of October. There were 12 30-day months, each with newly coined names, each with 3 10-day weeks. These were called décades, with the 10th day one of rest, décade. Sunday thus became a working day. The Republican calendar remained in official use for 10 years, but it was never taken seriously by the people. Most Frenchmen and nearly all French women preferred the saints and ceremonies of the Catholic calendar to the rootless festivals and formless supreme being of Robespierre. De-Christianization was not uniform throughout France and depended to a large extent on the fanaticism of the representative on mission. But the adoption of the revolutionary calendar encouraged the representatives to vie with each other in repressing every vestige of Catholicism. Joseph Fouché, the representative in Nièvre in central France, was a former Oratorian priest, imposed a reign of religious terror. No form of religion could be practiced in public. Cemeteries were stripped of all religious symbols, and at their gates was posted his famous dictum, "Death is an eternal sleep." Herbert Gédan, in his history of this period, considers that the enormous wave of de-Christianization which swept over the country between the summer of 1793 and the summer of 1794 completed the ruin of the constitutional church and drove it underground. No distinction was made now between juring and non-juring priests. Constitutional priests were now required to abjure their ordination. Only this step would prove their loyalty to the Republic. But large numbers of the constitutional clergy chose death rather than deny their priesthood. Of the 484 clergy who appeared before the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris, 319 belonged to the Constitutional Church. Many repudiated the oath which bound them to the civil constitution, begged to be reconciled to the Church, and died bravely on the scaffold. 8 constitutional bishops were guillotined, 5 of them recanting their errors before dying. Henri Daniel Roth states correctly that those sacrifices cannot be forgotten when we pass judgment upon the constitutional clergy. Churches were vandalized throughout France during this frenzy of de-Christianization. This actually sounds a bit like what happened after Vatican II, but images were destroyed, altarpieces slashed, stained glass windows smashed, liturgical books and holy pictures burned, and sacred vestments used in blasphemous parodies of Catholic ritual. The images of kings on the facade of Notre Dame were removed. There is scarcely a cathedral facade in France that does not bear traces of such vandalism. In addition to the destruction of Cluny, many great abbeys were razed to the ground, including Notre Dame de Montmartre, Royaumont, Longjumeau, and Jumièges. The word saint was removed from the names of streets, towns, and villages. Stone images of saints were solemnly guillotined. Clerical dress was forbidden. Churches were closed throughout the land, and by the spring of 1794 remained open for worship only in the remotest corners of France. Despite this, Mass continued to be offered in secret throughout the country. In Paris, at the height of the Terror, heroic priests offered Mass in 150 locations, and there were another 100 in the surrounding countryside. Along the route to the scaffold, there were always priests ready to give absolution secretly to those in the tumbrils. And if one of those chaplains of the guillotine, as they were called, was arrested, there was no lack of volunteers to take his place. 20,000 priests were terrorized into abjuring their orders, and 6,000 had given their renunciation the ultimate confirmation by marrying. The number of priests who died in the terror would have been vastly greater had not so many of them immigrated. Estimates of this number have been as many as 40,000, but this is, I think, certainly an exaggeration. It must be said to the credit of these priests that they refused to compromise with the revolution. But emigration was certainly an easier option than the persecution of the terror. But leaving in France did involve them in many sacrifices, both spiritual and material. Many were totally destitute when they reached the countries that they hoped would welcome them. Where most Catholic countries were concerned, they were swiftly disillusioned. Austria and Bavaria refused any emigre clergy entry, as did most Italian states, apart from those of the Pope, who received 5,000. Many great European abbeys refused their hospitality to the émigrés, and one of them, that of Weingarten, set dogs upon any French priest who tried to enter its cloisters. Spain welcomed the émigré clergy, as did the Catholic cantons of Switzerland, which accepted and cared for 4,000 priests. The great abbey of Einsiedeln spent enormous sums to help them. But one country in Europe exceeded the whole of Europe in its generous hospitality, and it was a Protestant nation. Henri Daniel Roth's right, but it was England who proved herself above all others the home of kindly hearts. She was publicly thanked by Pope Pius VI, who offered her as an example to the whole of Europe. Nearly 10,000 priests and 31 bishops made their home in England. Latest Pitt spoke of them in these words: "Few will ever forget the piety, the irreproachable conduct, the long and dolorous patience of these men, cast suddenly into the midst of a foreign people, different in its religion, its language, its manners and customs. They won the respect and goodwill of all by a life of unvarying godliness and decency." Thanks to this contact, many of the prejudices against the Catholics vanished in England, and the presence of these French priests helped in a large manner to obtain for English Catholics full equality of rights, and also pioneered the renaissance of English Catholicism in the 19th century. The heroism with which so many of the clergy, religious and laymen sacrificed their lives for the faith marks what must be the most glorious page in the history of Catholicism in France, the eldest daughter of the Church. That's why I was saying that Satan tries to do evil, but it turns into good. And this was certainly the most glorious page in the history of French Catholicism. From February 1794, 850 priests who had been arrested in northern France and Belgium, which had also been conquered by the Revolutionary Army, were imprisoned in 3 old ships, formerly used for the transport of slaves. They were subjected to appalling treatment by their captors. Many died in hideous epidemics, and when an order for their release was signed in February 1795, 7 months after the death of Robespierre, only 274 of the 850 were left alive. All could have saved their lives by renouncing their faith, but they preferred to use their sufferings to intensify their spiritual lives. The heroism of the Carmelites of Compiègne will also remain an inspiration to every Catholic who truly loves the faith. They were brought before a revolutionary court and charged with remaining together as a community after their convent had been suppressed. One of the sisters asked the president of the tribunal why he called them fanatics. He replied, "Your fanaticism is your foolish attachment to your stupid religious practices." Upon which he cried, "There you are, sisters, we have been condemned for our religion. What happiness to die for our God." At the foot of the scaffold they renewed their vows, and then intoned the Salve Regina, which continued until the last of them was silenced. Hardly less sublime were the Sacramentines of Bolène. Before dying they thanked their judges and executioners, and one of them kissed the scaffold before mounting it. The Republicans referred to our Holy Mother Guillotine, or Sacrum Sanctum Guillotinam. In the city of Angers it was constantly in use, but could not cope with the number of prisoners. The Republicans investigated several means of mass killings, including the possibility of poisoning wells or fabricating a poison gas to asphyxiate the prisoners. But at Angers it was decided that mass shootings, called fusillade, would be the most cost-effective method of eliminating Catholics. A fanatical Republican living just outside the city at Avrier offered his field for the purpose. "Send out as many as you can," he said. "They will make good fertilizer." Catholics were marched outside the town in batches of 400. They were tied together in pairs, and the pairs linked by a long rope. Ditches had been dug on the previous evening. The victims were lined up in batches of 50 and then shot so that they fell into the ditches. Many were only wounded, and they were finished off with swords and bayonets. Half the victims were women. This became a standard method of execution for Catholic prisoners. At least 2,000 were murdered in this way between January and April 1794. The field where these humble Catholics died is now known as the Field of the Martyrs of Avrier, and the track that leads to it as the Path of Silence. On the 19th of February 1984, 100 martyrs of Avrier were beatified by Pope John Paul II, including 12 priests who were guillotined and not shot. Many favours have been obtained through the intercession of these martyrs. The crime for which these poor people, mostly peasants, humble artisans, weavers and domestic servants, were executed was fanaticism. In order to be guilty of fanaticism, it was sufficient to be related to a Vendean soldier. I'll be telling you about the Vendean War this afternoon. To have hidden a refractory priest, to have refused to assist at the Mass of a juring priest, or to have made a rosary. We read in the transcript of the trial of Blessed Catherine Cotenceau. Question: did you receive refractory priests at Chanteloup, and did you assist at their ceremonies? Yes, I did. When you had a constitutional priest, did you assist at his Mass? No, never. The judgment that sentenced her to death reads, she detested the priest who had sworn the oath and wanted to keep her former cure. She is a fanatic. The letter F for fusillade, shooting, was written in the margin. The procession from the prisons to the field where the shootings took place was such a terrifying spectacle that the inhabitants along the way closed their doors and shuttered their windows to avoid seeing it. A witness to these appalling spectacles wrote, the air was heavy, as it is just before a storm. One could scarcely breathe, suffocated by fear. In the midst of this dark horror, the radiant faith of the martyrs could not be obscured. A witness of the martyrdom of Blessed Marie-Louise de la Saunière wrote, it was a heartbreaking cortege. The unfortunates were going to their death weeping and in torment, when suddenly a magnificent voice that seemed to have come straight from heaven began to sing. It was Marie-Louise de la Saunière. Radiant in her youth and beauty, she had a magnificent voice, sweet, calm, embellished by study, that comforted everyone to the point that the condemned who had just been weeping began to start singing enthusiastically. As they passed before the Church of the Trinity, a poor woman, badly clothed, shivering from the cold, stood by, watching the procession. Marie de la Saunière, moved by her misery, took off the shawl of silk and fur that she was wearing and gave it to her. At the sight of such beauty and such heroic charity, the procession stopped. Everyone, victims and executioners alike, looked on, moved and admiring. The officer who was leading the military escort, touched to the bottom of his soul, came forward respectfully to Mademoiselle de la Saunière and proposed marriage to her in order to save her life. I would like that, she replied, but on condition that you also save my mother and my sister. The officer, an honest man, answered that he could not do so, as it would be a promise that he could not keep. Very simply, the young girl replied, then let me die. With a voice even stronger than before, she took up the hymn to the Virgin Mary that she had been singing and continued on her way. Two sisters of charity were among the martyrs of Avrier, Blessed Sisters Marianne Vaillot and Blessed Odile Bogard. An eyewitness writes, Sister Marianne was tied to her companion and went courageously to her martyrdom without flinching. I would not exchange my place with anyone, she said. Her face shone with joy, but Sister Odile seemed troubled by the preparations for the executions. Sister Marianne reassured her and lifted up her thoughts to consider the crown destined for her. We must not miss such a beautiful occasion to witness for our love for our divine spouse, she explained. This is the most beautiful and most joyful day of our lives. He is going to put an end to all our miseries, and we are going to have the happiness of seeing God and possessing Him for all eternity. Hearing these words, the good Sister Odile recovered herself, ashamed to have feared death. She asked God and her dear companion to pardon her. The two nuns made their way, heads held high, to the site of their execution. On the way to the field where they were to be shot, Sister Odile dropped her rosary. She bent down to pick it up, and a soldier crushed her fingers with the butt of his musket. The spot where this took place was long revered, and pilgrims knelt there to pray. The rosary was recovered and is treasured to this day as a precious relic. Finally, like lambs led to the slaughter, the victims arrived at the place of their execution. They raised their eyes to heaven and offered to their Heavenly Father the sacrifice of their lives. They put their confidence in God and saw the heavens open to receive them. The officer in command of the shootings took pity upon the two sisters. He came forward and said to them, Citizens, there is still time to escape this death that menaces you. You have rendered services to humanity. Why, for an oath that you are asked to swear, would you discontinue the good works that you have always performed? Do not swear the oath if it's repugnant to you. I will take it upon myself to say that you have sworn, and I'll give my word that nothing will happen to you. Citizen, replied Sister Marianne, not only do we not want to swear this oath, but we do not even want to appear that we have sworn it. Do not think us so cowardly and so attached to this miserable life that you believe us capable of staining our soul and sacrificing it for an oath which we have always detested and still detest. God will not ask us to render an account of the services we could have rendered to our neighbour only by swearing an oath that he detests and condemns. If taking the oath is the only way that we can save our lives, we declare that we prefer to die rather than do anything opposed to the love that we have sworn for our God. The officer gave the order to fire. Sister Marianne remained standing, her arm broken. Like St. Stephen, she prayed for her persecutors. Forgive them, she said, they know not what they do. The soldiers threw themselves upon her and upon the other victims, cutting them to pieces with their sabres and bayonets. The culmination of the campaign of de-Christianization took place in Notre Dame Cathedral, now transformed to a temple of reason, on the 10th of November 1973. And Liberty, a red-capped female bearing a pike, a masterpiece of nature, euphemistically described as an actress, emerged from a temple constructed from linen and papier-mâché. She bowed to the flame of reason and seated herself upon a bank of flowers and plants while long lines of garlanded girls sung hymns. She was then escorted to the National Convention and embraced by its president. What a bunch of idiots. But a mob of Republicans remained in the cathedral to profane it with an evening of drunken revelry. Even Robespierre was shocked by this nonsense and described it as a ridiculous farce. 500,000 Frenchmen were imprisoned or placed under house arrest during the months of the Terror. At least 17,000 died on the scaffold. When those who died in prison or while awaiting trial are added to this figure, together with those who were simply murdered or lynched without trial or official record, the number of deaths rises to over 30,000 people in just a year. 15% of the death sentences were upon members of the nobility and clergy, and 25% upon the middle classes. And the vast majority of those who lost their lives in the proscription of 1793 to 4, two-thirds of those officially condemned, and doubtless a far higher proportion of those who disappeared unofficially, were ordinary people caught up in tragic circumstances not of their own making, who made wrong choices in lethal times, when indifference itself counted as a crime. For many Jacobins, there was little in these figures to shock. They preferred to see terror as a vital means of purging the country of those who, by their acts and opinions, had forfeited any claim to citizenship. In the preface to his book Citizens, Simon Schama insists that, in some depressingly unavoidable sense, violence was the revolution itself. Robespierre and Saint-Just were themselves arrested on the 27th of July 1794 and guillotined the next day with 20 of their closest supporters. Saint-Just acted the role of a Roman Stoic on the scaffold, where Robespierre died with animal screams that were silenced only by the falling of the blade. Within a month of Robespierre's death, the Committee of Public Safety was deprived against its own advice of its overall superintending role in government. All its duties, with the exception of war and foreign relations, were distributed among other committees. The central institution of terror and revolutionary government had been dismantled. In 1799 came the coup d'etat of Napoleon. The Republic was to all intents and purposes overthrown. It was to be governed by 3 consuls. Napoleon was appointed first consul for 10 years, but in 1804 he proclaimed himself emperor and ruled France in a manner far more absolute than any king had ever done. Napoleon Bonaparte never made the mistake of underestimating either the power of religion or the resilience of the church. This judgment was reinforced by peasant uprisings in defense of the faith in parts of France, above all in the Vendée, in Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg and Italy. When the revolutionary armies plundered churches and showed complete contempt for the religious faith of the peoples they claimed to be liberating, they often compared these revolts to the revolt in the Vendée in France. Bonaparte saw what damage such behaviour could do. In June 1800 he convoked the clergy of Milan to the great cathedral and declared, "It is my firm intention that the Christian, Catholic and Roman religion shall be preserved in its entirety, that it shall be publicly performed. No society can exist without morality. There is no good morality without religion. It is religion alone, therefore, that gives to the state a firm and durable support. As soon as I am able to confer with the new Pope, I hope to have the happiness of removing every obstacle which will hinder complete reconciliation between France and the head of the Church." Bonaparte referred to the new Pope as Pius VI had died in France in 1799, having been taken there as a prisoner of the Revolution. His death in captivity marked the lowest ebb of the papacy for many centuries. In 1801, Napoleon signed a Concordat with the Holy See. While it left much to be desired, it restored free worship to France, a properly constituted clergy, and papal power. William Doyle considers that the papacy emerged from the revolution as a stronger and more respected institution. He writes, only 2 more pages. William Doyle writes, despite serious material losses, in fact, the papacy was one of the great gainers of the work of the revolution. In the 1780s, it had appeared an institution in perhaps terminal decline, scorned by secularizing monarchs and defied in Germany and Italy by Jansenizing bishops. Its apparent helplessness did much to mislead the drafters of the civil constitution. But before the end of the 1790s, the Holy Father himself was sharing the glory of martyrdom visited on his fellow priests by a godless republic and its sympathizers abroad. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the population of France was showing itself loyal to a clergy which had rejected the revolution on his instructions. As Alwyn Houghton expressed it, popular Catholicism, with women in the vanguard, emerged from the Terror and Directory bloody but distinctly unbowed. A mass celebrated in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in April 1802 could hardly have provided a more dramatic contrast to the emergence of liberty from her papier-mâché chateau. April 1802 was to be a month of celebration. It culminated on the 18th, Easter Day, with a solemn Mass to mark the resurrection of the Catholic Church in France. It was held in Notre Dame in the presence of the first consul, Bonaparte, the entire government, and the diplomatic corps. The preacher was the 70-year-old Boischelin, once Archbishop of Aix, now of Tours. A nobleman of the old stock, he had delivered the sermon at the coronation of Louis XVI. As then, he celebrated a new beginning, but the jubilant crowds who thronged Paris that day, thrilled by the boom of cannon and the ringing of bells, silenced in 1793, and by the people of quality who lit their windows when night fell, were not thinking about what the future might bring. With the end of the war, the elimination of... when night fell, we're not thinking about what the future might bring. With the end of the war, the elimination of political strife, and the restoration of religious freedom, they were celebrating the burial of the revolution. And, I really do think the heroism of all those Catholics of France, especially the women. I wouldn't have... I think if that God had offered to marry me, I probably wouldn't have accepted. But, when you think of the September massacres, those people who went through those doors to be hacked to death, it is something that can make us proud to be Catholics. I'm hoping, Robert, would you be able to do? Yes. I just thought perhaps we could conclude for just 1 minute singing a little verse or 2 of Christus Vincit instead of you applauding. That would be much more satisfactory.
Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus imperat, exaudi Christe, ecclesiae sancte Dei, supra regnorum fines nectendi animas, salus perpetua. Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus imperat, Christus